Well, we're here. The big granddaddy of Metroidvania games. Yeah, you already know by now. I don't think it's a stretch to say that Hollow Knight is just as popular and beloved as the games that it was originally inspired by. And with all the Silksong protesting and demanding happening at quite literally every live game showcase nowadays, it may honestly be even more popular. But that might be a stretch. Hollow Knight is my favorite Metroidvania game, believe it or not. Maybe even my favorite single-player game in general. Don't get me wrong, I still love Metroid. I wouldn't have made over 3 hours worth of video covering the series if I didn't. But Hollow Knight, man, it just gets everything right for me. I love the art design, the combat, the setting, the hidden lore. I've beaten this game multiple times, and at this point I know the world of Hallownest like the back of my hand. But that wasn't always the case. Let's dive into a bit of background. What? No, not on the game, on me. This is my channel, I can be as self-indulgent as I want. This might sound a bit strange as someone who clearly loves Metroidvania games, but I really like having a sense of familiarity when I'm playing a game. I don't play a ton of new games or series, and by new I mean new to me. I tend to play a lot of the same games over and over again, games that I know I'll be comfortable with, and it takes a bit of convincing for me to not only check out and learn something new, but to want to stick with it and keep it as part of my regular rotation. Naturally, this can be especially true of games that are a bit esoteric, or in a genre that I'm not particularly familiar with. Most relevant to today's topic, I've tried several times to get into Dark Souls, a series that Hollow Knight is very often compared to, but I never make it past a couple hours. Of course, this isn't like a rule that's set in stone for me or anything. I've still had my fun with Metroidvanias like Symphony of the Night, Axiom Verge, Shantae and the Pirate's Curse, Cave Story, I think that's a Metroidvania. Does Batman Arkham Asylum count? While I enjoyed all of these games, most of them never really stuck with me the way that Metroid did. In June of 2017, I thought it'd be fun to broaden my horizons a bit and play one of the most renowned Metroidvania games ever made. One that flew under my radar for months, and one that I always heard nothing but praise about. Ori and the Blind Forest. And also some other game I never heard of called Hollow Knight. I don't know, my friend said it was good and it was in the recommended section, so why not? Keep in mind, this was only a few months after the game first released. It's crazy to think about now that Hollow Knight is one of the most beloved and hyped up indie games of all time, but it was a bit of a sleeper back then. This was before there was such a massive following that was dedicated to this cast of characters and the world that was created, before it was ported to consoles, and even before the many free expansions that followed the original release. I thought it'd be fun to take a shot in the dark at a game that I'd never heard of, one that stood out to me purely based on vibes alone. I'm a bit of a Hollow Knight hipster, if you will. Hollow Knight was released in February of 2017 by Team Cherry, an Australian indie game studio that's known for making, Hollow Knight. It's Team Cherry's first and so far only game released, and needless to say, they made a very good first impression. Even more ridiculous is the fact that not only was this game funded on Kickstarter and actually released, but from what I can tell, the game never had any more than 3 permanent team members working on it at once. That might be the craziest thing about this game. I genuinely can't believe a game this large came from a team this small. My first playthrough of Hollow Knight was one of the absolute best experiences I ever had playing a game. It says a lot that I can still remember so much of it nearly 7 years later. But if you know anything about Hollow Knight, it's that the world of Hallownest can be daunting and overwhelming. Let's figure out just what exactly makes Hollow Knight such a standout Metroidvania game for me, and more importantly, how it encouraged me to want to stick with it despite the impossible odds. Hollow Knight immediately opens with an excerpt from the Elegy for Hallownest. The poem speaks of one who allegedly brought order to the once wild and chaotic caves of Hallownest, as told from the perspective of Monomon the teacher. From there, we see some creepy dude chained away in a dark, forgotten cave, who then awakens and begins to break free from their imprisonment inside a massive black egg. Obviously, we don't really know what any of this means at this point, but it provides just enough info to the player that it gives them something to keep an eye out for once they start the game proper. Then we get a brief shot of our player character, the Knight, overlooking a small town, and we take control as it begins to approach it. Hollow Knight's story actually takes a pretty big backseat for a sizable part of the game after this. Not that it was really in the front seat, because, like, what the hell is this? But you know what I mean. We don't really know why we're here, and when talking to the NPCs scattered around the world, it's pretty clear that the Knight itself doesn't know why it's there either, so we're in the boat together with this little guy. I really appreciate that Hollow Knight doesn't immediately do a massive tutorialized exposition dump on the player as soon as they start the game. It might sound odd that I'd like for a game to be more unclear and confusing, given my giant tangent just a few minutes ago. But the little breadcrumbs they give to start off with are just enough to intrigue me to explore the world and answer any lingering questions I made up for myself. Like, who is Monomon the teacher? Why does everyone love Hallownest so much when it's kind of a shithole? Why hasn't anyone given this gangly chained up guy a damn ball and put him on the court already? Anyway, we eventually make our way to the little town of Dirtmouth, only to find that it's been mostly abandoned, with the promise of glorious adventure in the caves below. Our first step into the lost kingdom of Hallownest is through the Forgotten Crossroads, and it's just about as perfect of a starting area as you can hope for. The enemies within are afflicted with some kind of sickness or infection, which crazes them and turns them feral. A lot of NPCs throughout the game make note of the infection, the way it ravages the minds of Hallownest's denizens. Later on, we see the infection become stronger and more prominent, with our goal being to rid the world of it for good. The game's combat is extremely basic to start off with. All we get is a nail, which functions as a sword, but it's responsive and crunchy. It can swing in 4 directions, and it does the job just fine. The thing that really stood out to me at this point, though, is Focus, the healing spell. The knight needs soul to focus, which is primarily gained from fighting enemies, meaning the player needs to actively participate in combat in order to reliably heal. Focusing also immobilizes the knight and makes it vulnerable to attacks for a good 2 seconds before the heal actually goes off. There's a huge risk-reward aspect of focusing in the middle of a fight, and it rewards players for finding optimal healing times during enemy attack patterns. It's a really simple premise, but incredibly satisfying to master and be able to get clutch healing in desperate situations. Immediately to the right, we find the mysterious, malignant, mystical, magical, malevolent, egg from the intro, and Quirrell, a friendly face we occasionally run into throughout our adventure that subtly tells the player that they're headed in the right direction wherever they meet him, or that at the very least they're in an area worth investigating. The left path is the actual correct path here, but the right path eventually converges onto it anyway, so it's still worth checking out for some extra geo and other treasures. The crossroads in general are actually quite big and have a ton of branching paths, so it'd be best for us to find our bearings here. I said it'd be best for us to find our bearings here. Map! Yep, unlike most modern Metroidvania games, the knight doesn't start with a mapping feature by default. So for the time being, it really is up to the player to get the lay of the land on their own. During my first playthrough, I was just going through the motions, sort of autopiloting the game in the beginning, just taking in the pretty sights and crunchy combat, not particularly thinking too much of it. But as soon as I realized I didn't have a map, that's when something clicked in my brain and told me that I had to lock in. I started to really absorb my surroundings and gain more of an appreciation for the world around me. Every room has some sort of memorable landmark in it to help with navigation, whether that ranges from the small village at the bottom, to the entrance of the neighboring mines, to even a few locked gates. The branching paths I mentioned earlier all just led to dead ends that may or may not have some treasure as a reward. In fact, now I was finding it hard to even get lost. Most of the Forgotten Crossroads at this point all just kind of funnels into this one room, where we'll meet another friendly NPC. Cornifer's the best. His placement in the game is so well designed and is a perfect representation of pretty much everything I loved about my first experience with Hollow Knight. He appears in just about every area in the game, and when you first enter the room that he's in, you can hear his very distinctive humming. It's impossible to miss, especially in the first room at the Crossroads. From there, he'll offer to sell the player a map of the area for a small price, which, great, now I can figure out where Dude, what the hell? He barely mapped anything! Some cartographer. At this point, he basically just kind of shrugs his shoulders and says, "Oh, my wife sells more mapping supplies at her shop in Dirtmouth. GG, good luck." And this is amazing. No, really. From the get-go, it's really clear that Hollow Knight encourages the player to get a feel of the world themselves, and to rely on their natural sense of direction instead of depending on a map. This works because A, like I said earlier, virtually every room in the game has some kind of landmark or other feature to make it memorable and to help stand out from other rooms. And B, even if you do get lost, there's pretty much always something worth doing that'll help with your progression no matter where you go. So it doesn't matter as much if you aren't going the right way. Obviously, this mentality isn't going to work for the entire game, especially one as big as this. You can fill in more of the incomplete map if you go back and buy the quill from the shop, but crucially, the map doesn't update automatically. It only fills in new areas you find once you rest at a bench. I think this is a great middle ground between having to put in the effort to learn more about the world and just the basic-ass quality of life feature that obviously should be in the game. It's not like the quill is just an automatic free exploration tool.
It only shows you areas that you've already seen after you reach a designated stopping point. You still need to keep track of your surroundings when exploring new areas, meaning the quill is only really useful for backtracking and searching for areas that you may have missed previously. The perfect balance between mystery and convenience. But that's not all. No, this damn map will kick you down and spit in your face too. You may have also noticed that the map doesn't actually mark the player's current location while they're looking at it. That's another thing you have to go out of your way to buy from the map store, and it takes up a valuable charm slot that could otherwise be used to make the knight stronger or more agile, things that give a tangible bonus in the moment-to-moment gameplay. The map store even sells pins that mark important waypoints like benches, merchants, and stag stations, because yep, you guessed it, those aren't marked by default as well. None of this runs cheap either, particularly in the early game. This all sounds like a giant pain in the ass, and yeah, honestly, it is, but that's kind of the entire point. The game is subtly teaching the player a few different things here at once. Looking at what all these items actually do, we can decipher that the quill and the compass charm are the only two things here that are really worth buying this early on in the game. The pins are expensive, and that's annoying, but they're luxury items. You don't need them, especially not right now when the map is so small and there isn't a ton the player needs to remember. The player should be put off by these prices right now, which then encourages them to be more thrifty and strategic with their purchases, particularly since most of the things that the pins mark can already be noticed quite easily from the map itself. Like, yeah, obviously this is a hot spring, this is a stag station, and the player learns those things throughout the game as they familiarize themselves with the language of Hallownest's structure and design. So, all of that to say that through Hollow Knight's mapping feature, by making it difficult to fill in and even get in the first place, it's going out of its way to be as obtuse and frustrating to use as possible, while still being convenient, because it doesn't want the player to use it. It would rather have them take in the world through their own eyes and internalize new rooms and areas on their own terms. For me, this gave me a much greater appreciation for the world of Hallownest, helped especially by the fact that every room and the way they connect to each other is so distinct and memorable. This allowed me to form a deeper connection with Hallownest than I may have otherwise, had I just been able to quickly blast through the world without thinking much of it. Exploring deeper into the crossroads, I was able to rescue Sly, another shopkeep that resides in Dirtmouth. Sly sells general goods that help with exploration and combat, like mask shards, keys, and most relevant to my current situation, the Gathering Swarm charm that automatically magnetizes dropped geo towards the knight. I don't care if this is a noob charm or whatever, I will take it every single time. After rescuing Sly, I was also able to find the first of many stag stations, Hollow Knight's take on fast travel. Fast travel is a bit of a contentious mechanic in games that include it, but for a world as large and labyrinthian as Hallownest, I don't think there's any way they couldn't have included a system like this. Plus, this goes back to the idea that exploring the world for the first time should be as mysterious and engaging as possible, while backtracking should be kept simple and intuitive, and the stag stations are a key example of that idea. If anything, I felt that the world actually could have used a few more of these in endgame areas like the Colosseum and Junk Pit. At the center of the crossroads rests the game's first boss, the False Knight. Well, technically the Gruzmother is the game's first boss, but it's more of a mini-boss, so I'm not going to count it. Anyway, the False Knight is definitely the most challenging enemy we've battled so far, rightfully so. His sheer imposing girth and range make him really intimidating at first, but underneath that tough, crunchy shell is really nothing more than just a chubby, gooey little guy. He seems like more of a threat than he actually is, but still makes for a great formidable boss for newcomers. All of his attacks and movements are ridiculously telegraphed. He gives you like 10 business days to respond to everything he does. But it's not a drag for Hollow Knight veterans either, because there are ways to speed up the fight using the falling rocks that he summons during this tantrum attack. So I really like that the False Knight is able to fulfill a solid function for any Hollow Knight player, no matter how experienced. Hell, it's even possible to skip him entirely if you don't care about the city crest that he grants, which is just an optional one-time use item anyway. Not long after the False Knight, we collect the Vengeful Spirit ability from the Ancestral Mound, which gives the knight an attacking option at range. We learn that it can be used to defeat these beetle guys that are immune to the nail, and would you look at that, there just so happens to be another one blocking the way to Green Path, the next major area. Green Path is where I really started appreciating Hallownest during my first playthrough. I was enjoying the game in the Forgotten Crossroads, don't get me wrong, but that was more because I loved overcoming the challenge and unraveling the mystery of the world, not because I actually loved the world itself. Green Path was such a breath of fresh air when I first entered it. It still sells the idea of Hallownest being a forgotten, fallen kingdom, but unlike the spacious, largely empty Forgotten Crossroads, Green Path is teeming with wildlife and vegetation, and that harp is just beautiful. Oh, and green is my favorite color, in case you didn't know. The world is naturally starting to become a bit more complex at this point. There are a lot more branching paths here that can easily distract the player now that they're in a new area and back to having no map once again. Thankfully, Hollow Knight has a few more tricks up its sleeve here in the early game to help guide the player. We're introduced to this individual that probably bears no significance to the greater Hollow Knight franchise, who keeps eluding the knight just as soon as it gets within reach. This is Hornet, and she'll eventually become what's probably the closest thing to a companion we'll get on our journey. Oh, hey Coral. Here in Green Path, she's carefully placed in a few select areas where there are multiple routes that split off, having her indirectly guide the player on the correct path to take, where we then eventually meet up with her and summarily defeat her in a pretty easy boss fight. This is also where we get access to the Mothwing Cloak, giving the knight a mid-air dash to cross large gaps, dodge attacks, and just traverse more quickly in general. After that, we're greeted by the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and yet to come, who don't like how close we're getting to understanding the lore of Hollow Knight. Not me though. I personally didn't really get an appreciation for the game's story until after I finished my first playthrough and watched some enlightening content.
I don't work at ICE anymore.
But I think that speaks strongly to how effectively the game can motivate me to continue playing through its stellar world design and moment-to-moment gameplay, even though the story is kind of irrelevant to me. The cloak allows the knight to fully traverse through the Fog Canyon, where I spent way too long trying to look for a way to get to Cornifer and blowing myself up with these Metroid guys. But it turns out there's nothing of note here quite yet, and we're just supposed to quickly pass through it to get to the Fungus Bogs. Oh, sorry, wrong game. Fungal Wastes. Hornet eludes us as she's able to easily cross this massive gap into the heart of Hallownest, a location that the game has spent the better part of the last 2 hours hammering into our heads as something worth knowing about, but we can't follow her quite yet. The rest of the Fungal Wastes is mostly a straight shot down to the Mantis Village, a society of honor-bound Mantis warriors. It's on site with these guys, and they definitely gave me a run for my money. At the heart of the Mantis Village is our second movement upgrade, the Mantis Claw, giving the knight the ability to wall jump. Only one wall needed, just the way I like it. This upgrade is insane. It completely and utterly blasts open the floodgates on where you're allowed to go in Hallownest. You can go practically anywhere at this point. The first thing I did was immediately go into the depths of the Mantis Village to challenge the Mantis Lords, the rulers and strongest fighters of the Mantis tribe. Defeating them in battle would grant me access to the neighboring Deepnest, along with the respect and admiration of the Mantis warriors, and who knows what else. Not deterred by the challenge, I drew my nail to partake in a respectable, honorable duel. One so immense in its tribulations that its story would be passed down for generations upon my glorious victory. The first thing I did was make my way to the bridge that we saw Hornet cross earlier, now that we have the means to follow her into the heart of Hallownest, the City of Tears. I know I said I loved Green Path, but wow. Entering the City of Tears for the first time is just magical. The way the rain hits the glass as you overlook the city on your descent, and the way the music swells up for the first time as you hit the ground, it perfectly conveys just how grand and important Hallownest's capital city truly is. Hey, Coral. We meet with Hornet in front of the fountain where she tells us to find the Graven Ash, whatever that means. And upon inspecting the fountain, we see that it's a memorial to the Hollow Knight? Wait, what? I thought we were the Hollow Knight. Yeah, the Hollow Knight refers to our endgame goal. Our player character is never actually given a name throughout the story. Other characters refer to us with different names like Traveler, Tiny Thing, Child, Cringer, Walta, but I personally like Hornet's nickname, Little Ghost. This is the game's big plot twist, and it is a good one, but I can't help but feel that it comes too early. We're only like a third of the way through the game. If they spent more time keeping the identity of the Hollow Knight a mystery, I think it would have made for an insane reveal during the intro for the final boss fight, but I don't know. Maybe they needed a big revelation here in the middle to motivate the player to keep going. Inspecting the fountain also reveals the Hollow Knight's location to us, actually finally giving the player an objective on their map for the first time in the whole playthrough, like 3 hours in. And it just leads back to the Black Egg Temple that we already saw at the very beginning, which we still can't enter. I actually kind of love this. It's like the game's way of nonchalantly reminding the player that they still need to use their gamer mind and figure this out on their own. Like I said earlier, ever since getting the Mantis Claw, the map has opened up considerably, and we have a ton of different paths we're able to take now. Technically, we didn't even have to go to the City of Tears yet, but whatever, we like lore here, even though the story is kind of irrelevant to me. Our next stop is in the Resting Grounds, and we have a few different ways of getting there. What I assume is the intended path
is to make our way through the Soul Sanctum to get the Desolate Dive ability. I love how over-the-top sinister this place is with the organ in the background and just the overall gothic aesthetic, but it's teetering on the line of downright obnoxiousness with the lack of benches anywhere inside. This is the first area that I really considerably struggled with. It's a pretty cruel trek back to our corpse if we happen to die close to or during the Soul Master fight, and unfortunately feels more annoying than actually challenging. With the Desolate Dive, the knight can break through this floor back in the Forgotten Crossroads to enter the Crystal Peak, an absolute beauty of an area that stands out so much from the rest of the world. Hey, Quirrell. Going this way grants the Crystal Heart, but that's not the only path to the resting grounds. We can also buy the lantern from Sly to use the toll machine and waltz in that way. But the cool thing about this path is that nothing is stopping you from grinding Geo and buying the lantern at the very start of the game to enter the Crystal Peak before even fighting the False Knight. Yes, that's right, you fell victim to a classic Base Sam fib. The game doesn't start linear, it was open-ended from the very beginning. If the player's dumb enough to grind for all that Geo. Don't know who would ever think of doing that. Talk about stupid. This section of the Crystal Peak ends with a steep chasm that drops directly into the resting grounds, and it's even possible to get here without any movement upgrades if the player does that early lantern trick. Dumbass. If we don't feel like fighting Soul Master and happen to have a simple key, we can muck about in the Royal Waterways, a long, narrow, maze-like area that I personally didn't find to be very interesting or fun, especially with these looking-ass guys. From here we can access the east side of the City of Tears, and subsequently at the top of this building, an elevator that leads directly to the resting grounds. But what if we didn't go into the city at all? If we're successful in defeating the Mantis Lords back at the Fungus Bogs, like I was, we gain the respect of the Mantis tribe and are allowed access to Deepnest. But if we... then there's actually a secondary path into Deepnest through this hidden wall after getting the Mantis Claw, and even a third through the Fungal Core if we come back with a different late game item. At Deepnest Peak we're able to find the Tram Pass, which activates the tram back at the crossroads, taking us to, I don't know, maybe, the resting grounds? Alright, fuck, we get it, the resting grounds. Kind of a big deal. But what's actually here? Not a ton, to be honest. It's really quite peaceful with the lack of enemies and one of my favorite pieces of music from the game. But that's soon interrupted by another appearance from the Christmas spirits. Interacting with this memorial reveals to us that these three are actually the Dreamers of Hallownest, protectors of the vessel, which in this context is referring to the Hollow Knight, but I don't think you're supposed to know that yet, so shh, don't tell anyone, shh. They argue amongst themselves for a bit, arguing how the seals are weakening and that they must be undone, before eventually settling on sending us to the Dream Realm like it's Kingdom Hearts, which we then escape after being rescued by this moth lady. The seer grants us the Dream Nail, and we're finally given a proper objective to follow for the first time in the whole playthrough, that being the actual locations of the three Dreamers on the map. It's an immensely satisfying reward for all the aimless, unfocused exploration in the beginning of the game. We're actually given a purpose in this world. And of course, just because we know where the Dreamers are doesn't necessarily mean we know how to get there. That's still up to the player to figure out, so discovery and exploration are still very much part of the game, don't worry about that. The knight can go after any of the three Dreamers in any order, and each one has a vast multitude of ways to access them with different combinations of items, paths, and skill required. I'm obviously not going to go over every possible permutation, that'd take me months if not years with how slow I work on these videos. But I'd probably still get it out before Silksong. At the very heart of the Fog Canyon lies the Teacher's Archives, where we can find Monomon, the author of the elegy for Hallownest from earlier. That's pretty cool. The Watcher's Spire looms over the City of Tears, and here we can find Lurien, watching. What are you looking at? And finally, far off at the edge of Deepnest, outside of Hallownest's jurisdiction, the Beast Den hangs ominously, and here is where we can find Hera, the Queen of the Spiders. So that is a lot of different paths to take, not even to mention the prerequisites to get to them in the first place. This is where Hollow Knight really begins to shine. A classic issue that a lot of Metroidvania games struggle with is not just backtracking, but finding where specifically to backtrack to. If we take a look at Symphony of the Night quick, anal bag, that's me. One thing that always kind of annoyed me about that game is how many paths you can take at any given moment that just lead to dead ends with minor upgrades, with there only being one correct way to go to progress the story, and there usually not being a good way to determine which path that is. Hallownest, despite being much larger than Dracula's castle, doesn't have that issue because no matter where the player goes, there's almost always something worth doing, something that the player needs in order to progress further, and there's also almost always multiple ways to access it. I'd say this is the single biggest trick that Hollow Knight uses to make its immense world feel manageable. Just the sheer fact that there's always something to do around every corner, and never an incorrect way to go. So with our newfound objectives, I think we're finally able to go back to the question that I posed at the beginning of the video. What is it about Hollow Knight that made me want to stick with it? Remember, I am not slow to drop a game that doesn't immediately gel with me. Hallownest is not a very inviting world. It's dark, it's challenging, and it's unforgiving and unintuitive to navigate. Or at least that's how it appears on the surface. The first few areas do a lot of very clever tricks to make the player think that Hollow Knight will be this sort of massive, overwhelming adventure. Just to recap, we have no context for the story or lore, there's hardly any friendly NPCs, the world is empty and ghastly, and the game is very stingy on navigation assistance. Everything about the first few areas make the player feel like they're bumbling about in a giant labyrinthian maze, slowly working out and overcoming the game's systems, when in reality they're actually being given what's essentially a carefully curated guided tour, without explicitly saying that's what it is. Every route in the Forgotten Crossroads funnels into the room with Cornifer, whose map does all but say exactly where the next major checkpoint is. Green Path has a few branching paths, but just follow Hornet and there's no issue. And the Fog Canyon and Fungal Wastes are basically just straight gauntlets up until the Mantis Village. It reminds me a lot of that one episode of Steven Universe where the crystal gems put him through that fake obstacle course that he can't possibly fail in order to boost his confidence. One of the things I've really grown to appreciate the most about Hollow Knight is the fact that there's sort of a progression to the game's progression. The game is quite linear and tutorialized to start off with the one and only goal at the end being the Mantis Claw. Afterwards, the player still only has one objective, to get the Dream Nail, but now there are suddenly multiple different equally valid routes to get there, which is good because the resting grounds are pretty out of the way, and players may not immediately assume to go over there. After getting the Dream Nail, the game's progression upgrades again, and instead of only having one destination at a time, we have multiple objectives to take on at once, each having an abundance of routes and necessary item combinations to access them. None of this is really a new concept for adventure games. The Zelda series has done this loads of times in a bunch of its games throughout the years. But what makes Hollow Knight's implementation so great is that it's so subtle that you don't even realize what's going on behind the scenes until you look back on it in retrospect. The first couple hours of Hollow Knight are really putting in a lot of work behind the scenes to sell the world of Hallownest to the player. It makes them feel like they're overcoming these huge challenges on their own, encouraging them to stick with it and be mentally prepared for when the game eventually takes off the training wheels and opens up the map, actually becoming as complex and overwhelming as the player assumed when they first started. That is what sold me on Hollow Knight. With Hallownest being so satisfying to traverse through and master, it goes from being imposing and terrifying to actually quite enjoyable to explore and fill in the map. Despite the map itself being cumbersome, it ended up not being daunting or overwhelming at all, a worry that I always had in the back of my mind ever since first entering the Forgotten Crossroads. I greatly looked forward to uncovering new areas like the Kingdom's Edge, Howling Cliffs, Hive, and Queen's Gardens, just because I knew how fun and intuitive they would be to explore, and how I could just immerse myself in the stellar art design and combat. With one exception. Deepnest. Oh, good gravy, Deepnest. Where the hell do I begin? It's definitely the most infamous area in Hollow Knight, and I can speak from personal anecdotes that it's where quite a few people gave up on the game despite the strong beginning. Hey Mac, I'm working on a video about Hollow Knight, and I have this section where I talk about Deepnest and how it made a few of my friends quit the game. And I know that you didn't really like Deepnest either, so I was just wondering if you had any thoughts or if you wanted to share your experience at all for the video.
Sam, this is like the 8th or 9th time that you've called me and asked me this question. And I told you every time, stop doing it. You keep calling me. And I told you if you keep doing it, I'm going to block you, but you keep calling me every time. And I think maybe he's changed this time.
Deepnest is a merciless bastard of an area. It sets itself apart from every other area in the game by completely spitting in the face of all the lessons and design conventions that the game had so carefully set up everywhere else. I hate it, but I also kind of love it too. I love that I hate it. Deepnest has one primary objective: to be as cruel and oppressive to the player as possible. and it achieves this in part by deliberately going against every constant that the game has set up for the player up until this point. For the most part, there aren't a ton of memorable landmarks. Everything looks pretty much the same. Dimly lit, narrow, meandering tunnels that are more often than not hidden behind breakable walls and crumbling floors. It's very difficult to get your bearings here, made even worse by the fact that Cornifer is silently hiding away in this little crevice, being so afraid of his surroundings that the player can't even rely on his humming to find him and buy his map. The visuals and audio are nothing short of grotesque. The lack of actual music, the way cobwebs are strewn about everywhere, and how spikes writhe around at the bottom of most rooms. Ugh. I wouldn't say I'm afraid of spiders in real life, but if they hissed the way they do in here, I probably would be. Speaking of which, the enemies spit in the face of fair challenge by rushing you in huge, overwhelming waves, spawning directly underneath your feet with little warning, and going through this horrifying reanimating process after you think you're done with them. Ugh, get me out of here! Ah, that's better. Oh no. What have I done? Alright, see, normally if you're in over your head and go too deep in a difficult area in Hollow Knight, you die and respawn at your last bench, and can choose to either send it again, or just go somewhere else and give it another shot later. No harm, no foul. If you jump down this pit and use this bench, you are trapped in Deepnest. There's no way back up the way you came from the pit, meaning the only way out is to go even further into Deepnest, through more gauntlets of tanky enemies and more dark, esoteric mazes. If you can believe it, this isn't even the most cruel trick that can happen here. That honor goes to one of the hidden entrances to Deepnest in the Fungal Wastes, where the floor immediately breaks under the player as they're walking, and plunges them nail first down another pit. It comes totally out of nowhere, and I couldn't imagine what it must be like to first uncover such a wretched place so suddenly like that, especially with how comparatively peaceful the Fungal Wastes are otherwise. The other main entrance unlocked by defeating the Mantis Lords is equally as shocking, albeit in a different way, as we can see that the Mantis tribe has been fending off Deepnest's monsters, really effectively messaging just how dangerous this place is. The thing that always unsettled me the most about Deepnest is just how calculated all of its threats are. I don't mean like from a game design standpoint, but from within the context of the world. Most other enemies controlled by the infection are pretty clearly shown to be walking husks, acting on instinct, just kind of limbering, perhaps not entirely aware of their surroundings. A lot of the enemies in Deepnest, though, are more tactical and deliberate with their actions. These little spider guys that snipe at you from a distance, these huge hook-handed burrowing things and the way they weave back and forth, probably my least favorite enemy in the game. There's even a hidden boss that lures players in by having them question their own sanity and follow a mysterious doppelganger of themselves walking further and further into the depths. This all culminates when the knight finally reaches the Beast's Den, where... Nope. Obviously the vibes are just super off here. The game's done a pretty good job at showing that the benches in Deepnest are all no good. But I'm pretty desperate at this point, so we'll go ahead and put ourselves at the mercy of the freaky spider cult. Emphasis on freaky. I love the way the spiders are portrayed. They're extremely conniving and intelligent, going back to what I was saying just a second ago about how tactical the enemies in Deepnest are. We only briefly get a glimpse of one in the Weaver's Den, but they're always 2 steps ahead of us. They eventually leave us to rot not far from Hera's chamber, but the knight is eventually able to locate her. In order to break the seals on the Black Egg Temple, we have to use the Dream Nail to enter the minds of the Dreamers and defeat them from within the Dream Realm. I say defeat like it's going to be some epic boss battle, but no. They just kind of sit there and you just whack them like a piñata. It comes off as a bit anticlimactic in the moment, but it makes sense with the context of the other 2 Dreamers, who both have boss fights before entering the Dream Realm. And honestly, traveling through Deepnest is basically a boss fight on the human psyche, so I'm not pressed about it. The next 2 Dreamers require the knight to backtrack through familiar territory in order to access them, being the Fog Canyon and City of Tears. Because of that, it was kind of around this point that I started to feel like I've already seen almost everything that Hallownest had to offer, and we'd just be exploring these brief dungeons to get to the Dreamers, but that ended up not being the case at all. This is already quite a lot of ground to cover, but to my surprise, the world of Hallownest just kept growing and growing. At some point it even felt never-ending. I thought the City of Tears was the bottom of the map until I discovered the Royal Waterways, as I mentioned before.
Below the waterways rests the ancient basin, and I'm like, okay, basin, this has to be the bottom. It can't possibly go any deeper than this. Anyway, if you have a specific story item later on, it goes even deeper into the abyss, which is just like a massive pit that stretches on for what feels like forever. Then going even deeper than that once the knight has all the prerequisites for the good ending. The game does something like this in just about every direction, by the way. From here, my progression became very scattered. I was doing a bunch of small tasks that didn't really have much rhyme or reason, but again, all of it was useful or relevant to my end goal in some way, so I never felt like I wasn't making progress. After mucking about in the muck of the royal waterways for a while, I was able to come across the Dung Defender. Yeah, really. He's so silly and boisterous. His fight was a great high point in an area I otherwise didn't really care all that much for. Defeating him lets you flip a lever, ooh. And this lowers the water levels in Isma's Grove to grant access to Isma's Tear, the next mandatory item to beat the game. Well, mandatory for me anyway, I'm not very good at these skips. Isma's Tear is a little bit underwhelming, truthfully, since most of the other items have granted movement abilities, whereas this just lets you swim through acid. But I can't deny that it was very satisfying to finally be able to enter this room in the Kingdom's Edge after passing through it 100 times. Wait, this isn't even the proper entrance to the hive? What the fuck? Lower down in the ancient basin, going back to the idea of it just going deeper and deeper and deeper, we can face the Broken Vessel, a really awesome and challenging boss fight that grants the double jumping monarch wings, and has some interesting implications to the lore. But again, just kind of went over my head the first time through. After finding the final stag station in the Queen's Gardens, sort of a difficult endgame extension of Green Path that's somehow even prettier to look at, I was able to complete a side quest and unlock a hidden station in the Howling Cliffs, the starting area of the game. It's so surreal coming back here and seeing just how desolate it is. Hallownest may be a forgotten kingdom, but everything outside of it is just forgotten. We can even retread the beginning tutorial path, pick up a new charm along the way, make our way back to Dirtmouth, and even back into the crossroads the same way we first did, just for old time's sake.
Good Lord, what is happening in there?
So at some point while we were gone, the infection coming from the black egg worsened, to the extent that the environment itself has a lot of the same bulbous orange tumors the same way a lot of the infected enemies do. The game even goes as far to treat this like an entirely new area now referred to as the Infected Crossroads. Thematically, I absolutely adore this. A lot of the enemies become not only more difficult as the infection grows stronger, but more volatile and deranged, literally more explosive. The infection overtaking the crossroads builds more stakes in the game's narrative and shows just how important the Knight's mission is to recontain the Hollow Knight, and for all we know, it could be spreading to other nearby areas too. My only real criticism with this redesign is that, for some reason, I simply just can't wrap my head around. They block off two really important pathways that the Knight commonly travels through, one of which is next to a stag station, which forces the player to take the long way around instead. I guess they're trying to also make the traversal more difficult when the area gets infected, but it just comes off as cheap and unfair, when the rest of the game up until this point has been doing a lot of really clever tricks to make backtracking more convenient as we go along, not less. As for some of the other shenanigans I was doing around this time, I learned this crazy nail technique from some dude hiding at the end of this gauntlet in Green Path that eluded me for so long. I increased the damage of my nail in general, bought some more charms and equipment, rescued some more grubbly grubs. All of that to say that there's plenty of side content to flesh out the world and give every last corner something worth exploring for. It was fun to do some outward exploring, but Hollow Knight's final challenges actually rein the scope of the world back in on itself, and have the player return to previous areas in search of the remaining dreamers. I decided to first search for the teacher's archives within the Fog Canyon, now that I have the means to swim across this acid puddle in the fungal wastes. Yet another blocked path that tantalized me for so long. Hey, Coral. Like I said back in Deepnest, the other two dreamers are protected by their own respective boss fights. Guarding Monomon is Umu, who unfortunately gets my vote for the worst boss in the entire game. Umu is invincible to all attacks until Quirrell swoops in at set intervals outside the player's control. I enjoy the presentation here. It's a great story moment getting to actually battle together with Quirrell, a formidable and wise ally that we've had for the whole game. But it's super lame in terms of actual gameplay. It's basically just the Mario auto-scroller level in boss fight form, a far cry from just about every other fight in the game, where the pace is dictated mostly by the player, and there's hardly any mandatory downtime. Outside of that, it doesn't get any more interesting. Umu only has two attacks that both just indirectly summon lightning, making it feel not very imposing outside of just being a big bouncy bubble boy. Getting to whack Monomon herself is honestly more fun. Luckily, the boss protecting Lurien the Watcher kind of makes up for it. Well, bosses, I should say. At the top of the Watcher Spire, at the top of the City of Tears, sit the Watcher Knights. Absolute mega bastards of a boss fight. They're frustratingly challenging, but in a good way. These guys make up one of my favorite fights in the game. Individually, they're not so tough. They only have a handful of attacks. But what really ups the ante is the fact that we fight 2 of them at a time, with there being 6 in total. That is, unless you pull off a secret trick to smash one with a chandelier before the fight starts. I love that they actually went out of their way to add this. It's so cartoonishly stupid, and I love that it has an actual tangible effect on the gameplay. The game does quite a few bosses like this where the player fights multiple enemies at once, including the Mantis Lords that I sort of glossed over earlier. But the Watcher Knights always especially stood out to me because it really does feel like this never-ending gauntlet where they just keep endlessly respawning. This is really the first time that I felt skill-checked by the game's combat and had my progression walled like this. And I really enjoyed it because it took me back to those beginning few hours where it was just little old me against this vast, insurmountable world, and it reminded me of why I fell in love with this game in the first place. Only this time it was because of a combat scenario and not exploration. So the game is still finding ways to keep me on my toes even this late in. And with all 3 Dreamers taken down, there's nothing standing in the way of our little ghost in the grand finale of the game. Inside the Black Egg, which, might I add, is much bigger on the inside than it is outside, we come face to face with a familiar face that we faced all the way back during the intro cutscene, whom we can now confirm as the Hollow Knight. I love the way it just kind of stares at you while you walk around to break its chains. It's like, oh, damn, we're doing this? The Hollow Knight is almost certainly the most difficult boss the player has faced up until this point. Being trained under Hallownest's king, its fighting style has been honed to perfection. It's quick and agile, but also messy and unpredictable due to the infection's influence, especially later in the fight. The Hollow Knight is a vessel, similar to the player character in the broken vessel that we fought earlier, but its stature is, more significant to say the least. Like, it's just silly. To make another cartoon reference, the Hollow Knight is basically Rigby's brother from regular show. But I make note of this because its larger profile makes it really hard to avoid given how quickly it attacks. Like, really hard. I'm gonna be honest, and I'm not ashamed to admit this, the Hollow Knight killed me a lot. That move where he steps forward and slashes 3 times was a real run killer. I was stumped. I was stonewalled once again, but this time there just wasn't any way around it. I didn't know what to do. I had a skill issue. But that's not what we called it back in 2017. I simply needed to get good. I took a break for a few days. Everything I described up until now regarding my first playthrough has all been within the span of like a day or 2, so I got a little burnt out. Feeling rejuvenated, I thought it'd be a good use of my time to go on just a few more side quests to power up that little bit more and make it through the fight. This is where I really began to thoroughly explore the Kingdom's Edge, and it grew to become one of my absolute favorite areas. I put it off for this long because I was intimidated by the bulky, powerful enemies, but at the same time it lured me in with that beautiful, melancholic music and windswept ash particles covering the ground, giving the appearance of snow. Wait, ash? She tells us to find the Graven Ash, whatever that means. Ah. Well, I don't really see a grave anywhere in here. Regardless, we battle Hornet a second time, as she tests our resolve to see if we're worthy of bearing the King's brand, which all it does is evidently open the kingdom's gates. Sure. Basically, it lets us go into the abyss below the ancient basin, an area completely corrupted by void and darkness, inhabited by these ghostly fellows that happen to be the same type of shade that the knight leaves when it dies. Here we get the Shade Cloak, an upgrade to the dash ability that finally lets the knight go through these scary void barriers. Oh my god, these drove me fucking crazy when I first started. I cannot tell you how long I tried to find a way to get around the one fog canyon! With the Shade Cloak, I passed through the barrier in the Queen's Gardens, defeated the Traitor Lord, who's just a really lame, bigger version of the regular Traitor Mantis enemies, and met Hallownest's very own queen, the White Lady. She gives me some useless piece of junk. Who cares? I go to Deepnest and I pick up Sharp Shadow, baby! The Hollow Knight community usually rates Sharp Shadow as a pretty low tier charm because the damage done with the Shade Cloak is admittedly pretty pitiful. But I love it and will always equip it, because it increases the distance of the dash and makes it much easier to dash directly through a lot of the game's bigger enemies. Most importantly, the Hollow Knight. Oh yeah, baby, we're cooking. Another way I knew I wanted to increase my strength was by participating in the Coliseum of Fools at the very top of the Kingdom's Edge. This is sort of a gauntlet arena where the knight fights waves of enemies for geo, upgrades, and most importantly, glory. Actually, the weapon upgrades are the most important thing for me. That's kind of the whole reason I'm here. The first and second trials grant a piece of pale ore that can increase my nail's damage and a charm notch, respectively, which I'll definitely want for the Hollow Knight. I really love these gladiator-inspired designs for the Colosseum-specific enemies, and the way the arena constantly changes shape and size to keep the player on their toes. It's a tough gauntlet, but I just gotta keep telling myself that I ain't dying to no fucking mosquito. We don't need to talk about the third trial, let's move on. After a bit of a mental reset and with all of Hallownest's power resonating through my gamer fingertips, I knew for a fact that I had what it takes to defeat John Hollow Knight. I wasn't going to let just a few minor setbacks prevent me from seeing this through. In the course of about 15 or 20 hours, Hollow Knight went from a game that I was cautiously optimistic to check out to a full-blown obsession. Nothing could get between me and glorious victory. Except for the passage of time. What do you mean it took me 6 months to beat the game? I would never procrastinate finishing one project for months on end. Alright. It's not that I wasn't dedicated to Hollow Knight. I just got distracted with work and eventually college and probably a few dozen competitive Overwatch games. Really important stuff here, guys. The game had always been itching away at my brain that entire time, though, begging for me to come back and give it the send-off that it rightfully deserves. I mean, I was right at the end. So at midnight, on a random Sunday when I had class the next day, you know, the time I always feel the most productive, right before I'm about to go to bed, I challenged the Hollow Knight once and for all to ritualistic combat, to conquer the infection and seal it away for good. He was piss easy and I beat him first try, and I completely forgot what little I knew about the story, so the ending was really anticlimactic and didn't make any sense. The end. And that was my initial experience of Hollow Knight. Sorry to not embellish the ending to make it sound like this grand, amazing victory. That's just kind of how it felt for me. But to me, it was about the journey, not the destination. And that journey was one I would never forget. I knew that I kind of spoiled the ending for myself. I knew that really was my own fault. Despite that minor setback, Hollow Knight from then on was always a game that I held in very high regard, and was always on the top of my list of games to recommend to other people. It was really awesome to see this game succeed and grow, and get ported to all the major consoles. Over the course of the next year, Hollow Knight received 4 major updates that greatly increased the scope of the game, by about 12% if the completion percentage tracker is anything to go by. All completely free of charge, which is just insane to me, as usual. But I guess it worked out for Team Cherry since this game sold like a nightillion copies. This doesn't have anything to do with anything, but when I heard later on that Hollow Knight had free DLC, I was like, oh yeah, I remember seeing some of that, it's really neat. But I played the game before the first update came out. I was thinking of the Hive, which was so weird and different and disconnected from the rest of the map that I must have tricked myself into thinking that it was DLC. But nope, it was there from the very beginning. I picked the game back up a few years later because I was going on a big 100% completion binge for a bunch of games at the time. But let's just say that I really didn't fully grasp what I was getting myself into. Once again, the game was more than happy to put me in my place and just keep growing and growing and growing. I had a pretty good start from my original playthrough, but I had 3 major roadblocks ahead of me. The good ending, the Grimm Troupe, and Godmaster. The 3 G's of Hollow Knight, or GGG for short. I already praised the game's progression systems and its mysterious and insurmountable world, but it was during this revisit, playing all the new content, that I really started to appreciate the many other aspects of Hollow Knight's design. Hollow Knight not only has a deep, rich world, but also lore and combat mechanics. And these are the things that elevated it from simply a great game to one of my all-time favorites. The last thing I had left to do in the base game was to go for the quote-unquote good ending, aka the Dream No More ending. The process to do this is really convoluted, and I have my doubts that there are very many people that did this without looking it up, but it's still a pretty fun undertaking, and it's once again fairly open in the ways that we can tackle it. The first part of the process I actually already did. Defeat Hornet in the Kingdom's Edge, get the Shade Cloak, and find the White Lady in the Queen's Gardens, which gives 1/2 of the King's Soul charm. Useless piece of junk. Easy enough. To get the King's half of the King's Soul is a bit more complicated. Something I failed to realize is that the Seer, who gave us the Dream Nail, actually has a bit of a side quest where we can keep collecting essence in exchange for rewards. The one most pertinent to us right now being the Awoken Dream Nail at a whopping 1800 essence. I didn't really think to come back here on my own, and the game doesn't force you to talk to her or learn more about the Dream Nail,
But to be fair to the game, if you do actually go out of your way to talk to her, she makes it pretty clear that she wants you to collect essence and visit her every so often. So I guess I'll take the L on that one. The most efficient way to gain essence is by fighting these Dream Warrior bosses, and harder Dream variants of other bosses that we've already defeated. I'll be honest, I'm not super impressed with most of the Dream Warriors. Most of them are either super basic, annoying, or both, especially Elder Who and No Eyes. These bosses altogether grant way more than enough essence to get the Awoken Dream Nail, so I really appreciate that we get the freedom to pick and choose which bosses we want to fight, and more importantly, not fight on our quest for the good ending. The Awoken Dream Nail allows the knight to access the mind of one of the king's guards, where we can see that the king's white palace is stowed away in the dream realm and the king is... well, damn. The White Palace is basically the endgame platforming gauntlet, and really feels like something right out of Celeste or especially Super Meat Boy with the random ass saw blades everywhere. It's a good change of pace and I enjoyed the challenge. Path of Pain. That's all I'll say about that, make of that what you will. With the two halves of the King's Soul reunited, the knight can finally enter the deepest part of the Abyss and learn the truth about Hallownest and their own upbringing. Before we do that though, I used this time during my return to the game to reacquaint myself with its story and pick up on some of the details that I missed out during my first playthrough, which was basically all of them. So before we experience the big lore bomb, what the hell is actually going on in Hollow Knight? It's actually pretty interesting and it's really rewarding to piece everything together based on the limited NPC dialogue and lore entries and the like. Most of the backstory centers on the Pale King, whom we never actually properly meet throughout the game. He's essentially a god that was born from the corpse of a worm, whose body makes up the graven ash that we saw earlier. Oh. The Pale King's light had the power to grant intelligent thought to the otherwise savage, wild bugs that lived in the area. Most of the bugs abandoned the gods they previously worshipped and began to worship the Pale King instead, who would then go on to create Hallownest in his image. Hallownest is described as being the last and only civilization, which I think is just the Pale King talking out of his ass now that we know about Farloom and Silksong. But nonetheless, it is an impressive accomplishment to have such an advanced civilization built on production and commerce. The Pale King may be the only one powerful enough to stop Gandhi from his nefarious nuclear arms race. All is going well and good for Hallownest, until one day, one of the Forgotten Gods makes their grand return, the Radiance, the former god of the Moth tribe. Yes, they literally worshipped a giant lamp. No, I am not the first person to make that joke. The Radiance isn't too happy with the Pale King for hogging the limelight of her own people, so the memory of her light began spreading through the dreams of Hallownest's denizens, eventually manifesting in the physical world as the Infection. The Pale King then comes up with the absolute most batshit insane plan to counteract this. Like, it's genuinely fucked. He and the White Lady hatch hundreds upon hundreds of eggs and send them all into the evil demon darkness abyss that just so happens to be right underneath their kingdom, turning all of the children into thoughtless husks that can absorb and trap light. More specifically, the light of the Radiance. Then, for what I can only assume is a sick, twisted game, the Pale King has all of the ghost children compete with each other in a race out of the abyss, which, oh hey, we're up to speed for the flashback. The knight climbs to the top of the abyss only to see that it was just barely beaten out by another vessel, the one deemed to be the pure vessel, who would eventually go on to become the Hollow Knight. I love the way the Hollow Knight just looks at us here before it walks off. It's like, damn, I'm so sorry, bro. The door is sealed shut, and the rest of the vessels are sealed away in the abyss forever. Except no they're not, and no they're not. But whatever, they're just cool like that. The Pale King's ridiculous harebrained scheme involves raising the Hollow Knight to peak form, using its empty void of a mind to trap the Radiance within it, and then sealing it away forever with the magical equivalent of two-factor authentication in a giant black egg. Finally giving context for our main goal throughout the game, the egg is to be protected by 3 dreamers that gave up their physical forms to protect the seal on the egg from within the dream realm. There are so many layers to this plan that I can't believe it all just kind of fell apart so easily. Monomon and Lurien both did it to prove their loyalty to the Pale King and Hallownest, but Hera, being from the neighboring Deepnest and not seeing the baseness of the Pale King, did it only on the condition that the Pale King, gives her a child with royal blood, so to speak. This child is Hornet, who is not actually a hornet, but a spider, okay? And she would go up to become the princess of Hallownest and the protector of the Black Egg. The ridiculous egg strat actually works, and all seems well and good for a little while until, oops, turns out that the Radiance has taken form within the Hollow Knight and began slowly leaking out of the egg and infecting the minds of the bugs anyway. So all of it was for naught. Hate when that happens.
It's most commonly believed that the Hollow Knight became corrupted because it had a familial bond with its father. It seemingly knew how important of a task it was given, which gave it an identity and a sense of purpose, a light in the darkness of the void that the Radiants could take advantage of. Our Knight was never given the opportunity to create these bonds. It was cast back into the darkness that created it, never knowing the circumstances of its birth until this very flashback. It's not entirely clear what draws our Knight back to Hallownest, or how it escaped the Abyss in the first place, but regardless, it ends up working out because our Knight is more of a pure vessel than the pure vessel itself, ironically because it wasn't chosen to become the Hollow Knight. During the normal ending, the little ghost essentially performs a mercy kill on the Hollow Knight to free them from the Radiance's influence. The Hollow Knight even, let's just say, joins in on the battle against itself, and it's just absolutely brutal to watch with the full context. The Knight puts the Hollow Knight out of its misery and takes its place to contain the infection once again, this time seemingly for good. But in regards to the good ending, now that the Knight has learned the truth, the King's soul corrupts and transforms into the Void Heart, becoming permanently attached to the Knight's active charm inventory. The Void Heart unifies the power of the Void, giving the Knight the strength to not just usurp the Hollow Knight, but to eliminate the problem at its source. The boss fight against the Radiance is probably the most flashy, spectacular moment in the game. We have to physically challenge her to draw her attention towards our little speck of darkness, and she makes a grand entrance as we finally see the source of her signature cry we've been hearing throughout the entire game. All of her attacks fill the screen with blinding light, and the Knight will have to use every one of its movement abilities to keep up and avoid the onslaught. It's a long, tough fight, with multiple phases and arena layouts, and her attacks become more frenzied as the darkness begins to rise and envelop her light, before smothering her out completely. This is a satisfying ending. It definitively takes care of the main threat and gives proper closure to our main character. It feels the most conclusive of all the endings. But that isn't to say the standard ending is bad either. Yeah, I warmed up to it a bit, now that I understand what it's going for. Hollow Knight is never very direct on how it tells its story, so I kind of like that the ending you get is indicative of the effort that you put in to learn about the world. Sure, the standard ending is anticlimactic, but you don't even directly interact with the main threat, so of course it's going to be. But like I said, there's still more to do in Hallownest even beyond getting the best ending, as we still have 2 more G's to cover. We're down to GG, short for good game, which is what Hollow Knight is. Wait, that was our transition to the next section? That was so corny, that was horrible. How much are we paying this guy? Alright, that was also cringe, plus self-deprecating humor is not funny, so this guy just took like 2 L's. The next order of business for me was the Grimm Troupe. Basically, the Knight awakens an evil traveling circus that takes over Dirtmouth, and we're sent on a bunch of fetch quests to Danny Phantom some ghost bozos to empower our cute little baby. The Grimm Troupe is probably the most expansion-y feeling expansion that they made, because everything about the gameplay and lore with the Nightmare Heart and the Grimm Child ritual is super disconnected from the main game. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It makes it easier to avoid if the player isn't particularly interested in it, since you need to have the Grimm Child charm equipped to even see the ghosts, and it makes for an interesting and fun break from the main plot. I just wish the Nightmare Realm was fleshed out just a bit more. It could have been a really interesting counterpart to the Dream Realm that we spent the entire main story learning about, but maybe that's a bit too far removed from the main storyline. Troupe Master Grimm is another extravagant boss, and I love how committed he is to putting on a good show, and how he even gets mad at you if you go off script. But of course, he doesn't even hold a candle to his more difficult counterpart, Nightmare King Grimm. This guy was a rude awakening for me, to say the least. The Mantis Lords, the Watcher Knights, the Hollow Knight, the Radiants, none of them hold a candle to Nightmare King Grimm. He's faster and harder to dodge than Troupe Master, and if that wasn't enough, does double the damage too. I probably grinded attempts for 2 or 3 hours straight before I was finally able to get him. But all that time with Nightmare King kind of gave me a greater appreciation for Hollow Knight's combat system. Maybe it's Stockholm Syndrome, but I started to see a lot of the more subtle intricacies with the movement and nail mechanics, since no other boss until this point required such a high skill level. I would just sort of brute force my way through all the other bosses, thoughtlessly swinging my nail, running straight into them, and with max damage upgrades and the right charm build, it was really easy to do so. Grimm requires rote memorization of all of his attacks and careful and intentional positioning, knowing exactly where to move and when to swing. We're essentially performing a dance routine with him,
one that needs to be practiced and memorized, which is fitting since he is putting on a show for his audience. And this discussion on combat actually leads us nicely into the final G, the GOAT of Hollow Knight DLC, Godmaster. It's essentially this game's boss rush mode, but it takes place diegetically within the world of the game, and has lore that's even more ridiculous than the Grimm Troupe. Residing deep within the royal waterways is the Godseeker, whose dream house is Godhome, a place where she and all the other Godseekers come to attune their minds to the gods of Hallownest and ascend with knowledge? Power? I don't know. I love the way the Godseeker just absolutely detests the Knight and insists that it isn't worthy of being in godly presence, despite having the potential to be the strongest being in Hallownest.
Blasphemy. Rank blasphemy, thou crawler, thou cringer, thou smallest of small. By what right dost thou trespass here?
Nuh-uh! Within Godhome, we can battle Hallownest's most godly creatures as part of the attunement ritual. I don't know in what world Vengefly King is a godly creature, but whatever. Attunement must not be an exact science. The bosses can be fought individually, or through pantheons, essentially playlists of about 9 or so bosses with a new one at the end, exclusive to Godhome. It's really awesome getting to battle some of the allies we made along the way, like the Nail Brothers, Sly, and Tizo. Ooh, never mind. Godmaster features virtually zero exploration, which I thought would be a major turnoff for me given that's the main aspect of the game that I originally fell in love with. But like I said about Grimm, it ended up just becoming an opportunity to really truly appreciate the depth of Hollow Knight's combat. A deep dive into the combat mechanics this late into the video? Fuck it, who cares anymore? This is when I started to appreciate the combat, so this is when you get to appreciate it too. Unlike many other platformers, the Knight doesn't carry any momentum when it moves. That is to say, it moves and stops the instant you press and let go of the D-pad, and it has completely uninhibited air control. If Hollow Knight had focused on more kinetic platforming challenges that required slick, buttery movement, this would feel incredibly stiff and rigid. But since the game is slower paced and puts a greater emphasis on combat than most other 2D platformers, it gives the player finer precision with their movement, and makes it easier to quickly dodge incoming attacks. And this also applies to the nail itself. You don't have to wait for the swinging animation to play for the hitbox to appear. It just appears as soon as you hit the attack button. It's really basic, but it works to the game's advantage, especially early on so as to not overwhelm the player while they're already trying to deal with the game's other systems. If I could describe Hollow Knight's combat in one word, it would be intimate. Don't make that weird. The nail is the primary way that the Knight will be doing damage to enemies, so it necessitates the player getting close with their enemy, learning their attack patterns, and knowing when it's safe to weave in and out of the fight to continue hitting them, as we saw with Nightmare King Grimm. The tight movement gives the player a lot more precise control over where they position themselves, and makes it less likely that they accidentally careen into an incoming attack. This is an oddly specific thing to point out, but I actually really love the fact that the Knight is still able to move while swinging the nail. Some games, like Symphony of the Night for instance, have the player stop in place when they swing their weapon, and it just feels so clunky to me. It just feels cheap and causes me to get hit by some bullshit that I couldn't really otherwise avoid. Maybe I shouldn't be playing so recklessly, sure, I'll give you that, but here's another one for you. Since Hollow Knight is designed around being able to attack and move at the same time, it allows enemies, and especially bosses, to be created in such a way that it expects the player to do both at once, making them a lot more frenetic and fast-paced. And that's not even getting into the soul meter and all of those interactions. I already brought up at the beginning how much I love the healing spell and the risk-reward factor of it, but that also applies to the many attacking spells the Knight can learn, being the Vengeful Spirit, Desolate Dive, and Howling Wraiths. I'll be completely transparent, I don't personally use spells very much. Here's my charm build if you want to make fun of me for not including Shaman Stone, but I know that they're the meta in speedruns, and I still really love the decision making involved in using them. Just like Focus, the damage spells all require soul to use, and the only way to get soul is to use the nail. This means that we only get a limited number of spells to use before we have to engage in melee combat again to build our soul back up. In that sense, there may be a bit less playstyle and loadout variety being encouraged, but the game is most obviously designed around its melee combat, and it's where a lot of the game's most important decision making takes place. So it makes sense that they don't want the player to be able to safely cheese important fights from range. But rather than being an equally viable alternative to the nail, or a crutch to non-nail inclined individuals, the spells instead fill an important niche that becomes more and more powerful the better the player is at the game. Since there's a cap to how much soul we can carry, it means that attacking enemies with a full meter essentially means that soul is going to waste. So if we're performing well enough that we don't need to heal often, we can use our stockpile of soul to attack enemies and end battles even quicker. Or, miss, and die. Each spell also has their own specific niches to make them all viable in different situations. The Spirit has the farthest range and can be used for tricky speedrun maneuvers, the Dive gives iframes to dodge attacks, and the Wraiths do the most damage if you can get the enemy to stay inside the damn thing. This decision making involved in knowing which spells to use and when to use them becomes especially apparent in the Pantheons, where we may want to spam spells to get an easy fight over with, only to realize that we needed that soul for healing on the next, more difficult fight. The first two Pantheons really aren't anything all that crazy, which makes sense given that they are the earliest bosses in the game. If anything, I guess it gives me more of an appreciation for when you fight these guys in the main story. Some of them have a few advanced strategies we can do with our fully decked out loadout, though not always, and it can become a bit of a drag. The highlight for me was the new boss Paintmaster Shio. He has a great gimmick where the color of his paintbrush actually telegraphs which attack he's about to use. It's really fun and cute. Pantheons 3 and 4 are where things really started to pick up. We get a good mix of great bosses like Sly and the Pure Vessel, my personal favorite boss in the entire game, being the perfect balance between difficulty, fair challenge, and fun factor. We even get some more middling guys like Grey Prince Zote, and just the absolute worst, most awful and terrible bosses like Elder Hu, Markoth, and a new version of Umu that's somehow even worse than the story encounter. After defeating Pure Vessel in the 4th Pantheon, the Radiance reveals itself, and the Void begins to unify and ascend to destroy it, similarly to the Dream No More ending. Godmaster is the only expansion to feature its own ending, and in order to see it, we have to conquer the Pantheon of Hallownest. I love the Pantheon of Hallownest in concept. It's a straight gauntlet of almost every single boss in the game, culminating in a battle against Absolute Radiance, a significantly harder version of the Radiance that's faster, does more damage, and has more phases. It's a massive undertaking. It just sounds really cool when you describe it out loud, and it's an amazing accomplishment to complete it. But then there's the actual experience of playing it. The Pantheon feels more like a test of endurance rather than a test of the player's skill at the game. It takes nearly 40 minutes of straight battling to even make it to Absrad, including yet more new fights like Wing and Nosk and Sisters of Battle, another one of my favorites. Then towards the end we have nearly back-to-back fights with Ascended Markoth, Zote, Nightmare King Grimm, and Pure Vessel, and by then the player will probably be so fatigued that they'll make one little slip-up and just snowball with mistakes from there, assuming they even make it to Absrad in the first place. By the way, chat, if you're new to the stream, Absrad is short for Absolute Radiance. I'm just using slang. Fighting every boss in a row sounds cool on paper, but it isn't in practice when half of them are just mindless fodder only there to waste your time, and it doesn't get legitimately challenging until almost the very end. All of a sudden, we have to defeat Nightmare King Grimm and Pure Vessel back to back, two bosses that both took me hours to complete the first time around. The Pantheon of Hallownest should have just been the top 10 hardest bosses in the game. That would still have most of the same prestige as the current Pantheon, just with all the fat removed. That's not even to mention that Absrad just isn't a very well designed boss in my opinion. It asks way too much of the player in comparison to even the second hardest boss in the game, and I've been put in situations where I can't possibly avoid taking damage more times than should be reasonable, especially considering some of the glitches and the visual clutter of all the attacks that blend in with the background. It feels like they cranked up the difficulty not for the sake of having a fair challenge, but to just have a super hard boss at the end of a massive gauntlet. But maybe it's all worth it in the end. The final phase where the music stops and we have to slowly whittle her down while avoiding the homing orbs, it's probably the most tense I've ever felt playing a video game, and is the definite highlight of the battle. And after all that torture, days of attempts, I can't deny that it feels fucking incredible to finally luck out and beat this bitch. From here, we get a sort of enhanced, crazier version of the Dream No More ending. The Void, empowered by ascending over the Radiance's true form, coalesces into the Shade Lord, and begins escaping Godhome and corrupting the very essence of Hallownest, ending with a shot of Hornet facing off against the Hollow Knight. This ending's weird. I guess an alternate ending is a worthy reward for beating a challenge like the Pantheon of Hallownest, but it's just strange for side content like Godmaster to take over the lore of the game so dominantly.
Like, you don't even physically see the Hollow Knight on this route, the namesake of the game. It is also kind of cruel to lock an achievement behind beating the Pantheon, especially since a lot of the other harder challenges like the Path of Pain don't have achievements. But I guess whoever gets it has an official gamer badge of honor. Or shame. Probably shame.
So I think I made it pretty clear that I found the Pantheon of Hallownest, and especially Absolute Radiance, to be a fairly miserable experience. And overall, it's probably the biggest blemish on Hollow Knight's otherwise phenomenal track record. I really don't have much luck with this game's endings, do I? But if my biggest complaint with this game is that the final challenge for the completely optional side mode that doesn't even count towards completion percentage didn't totally stick the landing, then I guess it's not really such a bad problem to have. Like I said before, it's about the journey, not the destination.
And that's the bulk of my time with Hollow Knight. The only achievements left from there are basically just speedrun challenges and branching story moments that can only be done once per save file. It was a nice little victory lap after the insanity of Godmaster, but I won't bore you with that any further. Hey, Coral. Hollow Knight is a masterful game on just about every front, and is an exceptionally impressive showing for a Team of Three's first commercial game. My experience with the game is certainly one I'll never forget. For the first time in a long while, I came into a game timid and uncertain. I took a chance with something that I knew would be daunting and unforgiving. Even back then, the Dark Souls comparisons were rampant, but something about it stood out. The art. It was probably the art. I was committed to the game. I wanted to see it through to the end. Little did I know that Hollow Knight secretly wanted me to see it to the end. On the surface, it sells itself as this massive, confusing, unrelenting experience, a genuine mystery to unravel in the modern age of information, where such experiences are a rarity. And well, it was that, but at the same time, Hollow Knight is a simple game with basic and easy to understand systems, rich lore, and crunchy combat. And this is all here to support the core of the game, the exploration, the mystery. Navigating Hallownest the first time around is a daunting experience, because the game is purposely being an ass in regards to navigation assistance, but it makes up for this with all the other systems being so simple and intuitive in support of the exploration, so that the frustration never adds up and the game never becomes too irritating. Hallownest is meticulously designed to give players the freedom to do just about anything they want, however they want. There's basically always something to do around every corner. It's very likely that any two players' paths are going to look very different, and branch out in some crazy way at some point or another. And I love that the game supports the player in doing this with its vast, open-ended design, and brilliant uses of secrets and shortcuts and Easter eggs and just so many other things that make Hallownest one of my favorite worlds in gaming. And for those that are willing to take a peek beyond just the world of Hallownest, there's still tons of opportunity to master the game's combat with its loads of challenging, fast-paced enemies, and especially bosses. I said the combat was simple, but I didn't say it lacked depth, and there's plenty of it here. I can definitively say that Hollow Knight is one of my favorite games of all time. Not only does it excel in just about every aspect of its design, but it gave me one of the best and most memorable stories that I've had completing a game. And I'm elated that I gave it a chance all those years ago. There's something in Hollow Knight for just about everyone, and if you don't think there is, you should give it a shot anyway. Go outside your comfort zone. It might just win you over.